Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third seminar in the UE St. Augustine Faculty of Law Research Seminar Series. We have two guest speakers with us today. We have Sinead Moloney from Heart Publishing, who will be speaking to us first on the business of book publishing. So she'll be giving key tips for authors, and we must thank for stepping in. As you know, this is a short notice change in the schedule as her other colleague had a personal issue today. So Sinead, thank you very much for stepping in on short notice. We really appreciate Heart's presence with us today. We also have Jean-Pierre Gauci, who will be presenting on applied legal research, which I know is going to be particularly interesting for those of us who want to go into research careers to see what different fields are out there. So both of our speakers, I will actually, of course, do a bit of a full introduction for yourselves as much as you are comfortable when I hand over to you. So the format, as always, for those of you who have been here before, or for those of you who are new, is that we have a 20-minute presentation by each speaker, followed by 10 minutes for questions. You can put your questions in the chat and I will direct them to the speakers. And of course, you will be invited to raise your hand to use your mic as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sinead, and thank you very much, Sinead, for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Emma, and thanks everyone for joining the session. Apologies, I don't have any slides, but I will just give a general overview to publishing. It was suggested it might be interesting if I talked just very quickly about Heart. So apologies if you know all about Heart already, just to give a little bit of context. Then talk about sorts of products we do, sorts of subjects we do very quickly before I go into, I suspect, what most people are keen to hear about, the business of proposals, what publishers want, peer review. I'll touch at that stage a bit on edited collections and other things to keep in mind if you are thinking of putting a proposal with an edited collection. And very briefly at the end, I'll touch on new editions. I'm conscious we don't have a lot of time, so it'll be quite general. And obviously we'll have time for questions at the end. So my name is Sinead Moloney. I'm the publisher at Heart. In terms of my own fields of commissioning, I oversee very generally the international law list, the European law list, and the private law list. However, what I would say here really is not subject specific. The requirements that we have in place for proposals really are similar across our various subject areas. So I'm hoping most of you know who we are at Heart, but we're a legal academic publisher, originally an independent publisher based in Oxford. We were acquired by Bloomsbury Publishing about 7 years ago. But really, the academic monograph is at the core of what we do. So research works, which are written by academic lawyers for academic lawyers, which sell basically to university libraries in the main. In addition to that, we also do student textbooks and some practitioner books. But you know, the absolute nucleus of our list is the academic monograph. In terms of our subject areas, we're a pretty broad church in that there's very few subject areas we don't go into. They're within subject areas, obviously for strategic reasons. We may not publish. But really, we do the full spectrum of legal publishing. So right through from private law, constitutional law, environmental law, my own subject areas that I mentioned, international and European law. So as I say, there are very few subjects where we don't publish in. We certainly have subject strengths. I would say there are probably constitutional law, private law is a very strong list for us as well, and jurisprudence. And our key markets, obviously the domestic market for us in the UK, Europe, but we are a global publisher. So we publish for the whole market, we distribute and we market globally as well. So that's very quickly Heart and what we do. In terms of how we do it then, and things to bear in mind when you're talking to Heart as an academic publisher, but indeed any academic publisher, the most important process, as you'll all be aware of, is peer review. So everything we publish is subject to peer review, but particularly the academic monograph. Our brand is incredibly important to us. You know, we do see our imprint is an imprimatur of excellence, and how we can ensure that is to continue to peer review and to check all the proposals that come through. So every book we publish, we will want to see a fully worked proposal and some writing from the proposal. So in terms of managing your own expectations in terms of what we want to see from you. We will want to see writing from the project. We don't necessarily have to see all the writing, but we will want to see at least one sample chapter. So the proposal really should be extremely clear on what your book is saying. The more focused, the more explicit a proposal is on exactly what the research question at play is, how the research question is going to be answered, who the book is written for, the better it is for the publisher and indeed the academic peer reviewers. And that can sometimes be counterintuitive. Sometimes we will get proposals which say this book is written for all the lawyers in this particular subject area, be they graduate students, undergraduate students, academics, and everybody within this area of specialism will want to read it. That's very unlikely. And actually, in our heads, our worry is if a book is written for everyone, essentially it's written for no one because it falls between the two stools. Be very confident in terms of what your book is saying, be very confident in terms of who your market is, and be very, very consistent and clear in that messaging. I would say by the second sentence, I would like to have a sense of what the book is about. If I have to read a proposal 3 times and I still don't know precisely what the question at play is, I start to get slightly concerned that over the course of an academic monograph, which might be 200, 300 pages long, the book loses that focus. So that's the number one hint and tip I can give people. The second one is originality is key. So we would expect every monograph, and when we talk about monographs, we're talking about authored books and edited collections. Publishers tend to use the term interchangeably, but when I speak to the edited collections, we have slightly different considerations when it comes to proposals for edited collections. But the second point with the monograph and edited collection is it's making an original contribution. So again, be very clear on this and be confident in making that claim. Your sample writing will support all the claims you make in the body of your proposal. The easiest way to show the publisher the original contribution that your book will make is to place it within the literature in the field. So we always suggest that people start their proposal document with an abstract, which is usually about 500 words, pretty similar to what you'd use in putting a journal article together. It really sells the book extremely clearly, extremely confidently. It sets out, the parameters of the study and the methodologies that you're employing in the study. Then if you follow by a literature review, which is basically where you identify those 2, 3, 4 books that have asked similar questions to your proposed book, that are looking at the same question from a different either methodology, different jurisdiction, whatever it might be, and then situate your book within there. So essentially what you say is, book A does this, my book does this, but I use a socio-legal approach, whereas book A is doctrinal, or I look at from a comparative perspective. Whatever whatever the difference is, identify it. That's extremely helpful, particularly to the publisher, because a publisher can immediately place the book. If those books happen to be books published by the particular publisher in question, that's even better. It's not a requirement. You should pick the most useful examples. It's not exhaustive. It's not a bibliography. As I say, at least 2 books, maximum 5, I would have thought. But that's very, very helpful to the publisher as well. It's also helpful to the peer reviewers because it sets the ambition for the work. It tells the peer reviewers, this is the debate I'm jumping into, and this is what I want to say within that debate. Then a fully worked table of contents in the body of the proposal. Because we don't review the entire book, this is important because it acts as a roadmap for the peer reviewers, so they can see where certain arguments will be happening. So there, your table of contents with a paragraph for each chapter, just putting a shape on what each chapter will cover. And then finally, a comment on the word count. Word counts are extremely important for publishers because really from the commercial point of view and from the costings point of view, everything runs from the word count. So be as accurate as possible with the word count. It might possibly change during the process of the peer review, but it's very important that from the outset we have an idea of the word count. And just to kind of clarify that does include all notes and references as well. and then some sample writing from the proposal for the project. Now, this should be something that really shows the strength of your argument, the originality of your approach. So essentially not a chapter that's particularly descriptive. So not the introduction is really what I'm saying. You can certainly provide the introduction if you think it helps, but the point of the sample chapter is essentially those great claims that you make for your book and the proposal. We then say, right, sample chapter shows us and shows the peer reviewer exactly how it's done. So that's a very quick overview of a proposal, you know, what we need in a proposal and the purpose of the proposal and the sample chapter. I'm going to come back to the edited collection now. Emma asked would I speak to this particularly. The same requirements are in place by and large. You know, we still see an edited collection value as an edited collection that has excellent scholarship, that makes original argument and has a very clear research question in mind and is very clear in terms of what it's trying to do. But there's a slightly extra hurdle you have to overcome in an edited collection. And really what you're trying to overcome is the worry that it's not more than the sum of its parts, that basically it's a collection of, you know, 10, 12 interesting but disparate essays that aren't pulled together around a particular research question. So in a proposal for an edited collection, you as the editor should really put extra work into that. And some of this can be very practical. It could be, you know, I've selected these contributors precisely because of their expertise in this particular area. I've given a strong editorial guidance. You know, if, for example, you know, there's you know, people don't tend to use questionnaires as much now as a research methodology, but if, for example, there was a standard questionnaire that people were using across the chapters, I would flag to that, because that's already alerting both the publisher and the peer reviewers that actually, yes, from the outset, it was very clear in the editor's head what the book was trying to do, and the editor has and will give all the contributors involved a very clear editorial steer. Another thing to say about proposals for the edited collections, the lineup should be more or less finalized. I know that's tricky given the timing because you haven't got a publisher's commitment yet. And there will always be a certain degree of movement because people will have other commitments. But essentially, you know, we would expect that if we do go to contract offer, that, you know, the book, the table of contents, the list of contributors maps very closely onto what was originally said. And the final point on edited collections is, and this is becoming more and more material, shorter edited collections are better. We definitely have an optimum amount of essays in mind, and that's 12 usually, up to about 15. And there's two reasons for this. One is commercial and practical. Edited collections tend to be a bit more complicated to do. They tend to need a little bit more copy editorial intervention, for example. So there are extra costs involved. Even things like, the extra free copies, they do start to add on to kind of the pressures on a project. So that is one consideration. But the more important consideration really is that actually it's much harder to keep this strong editorial focus in an edited collection over 20 essays as opposed to over 12. So 12 to 15 is very much our optimum length. That's not to say we haven't published longer books, but we would have tested that in the review process. So there are the proposals, and pausing particularly on edited collections. I've only got 3 minutes left, so this is going to be a very quick overview of the review process. But just to say, the peer review process is in place for every book that we publish. It's extremely important. We do see it as collaborative, we do see it as constructive, and we do see it as something that essentially gets us to the best version of the book. If a publisher is sending your book out to review, the publisher is interested. We're not going to send books out to review that we think either don't fit our list or indeed we aren't persuaded by the proposal. So essentially the publisher is telling you, we're interested, we now need reports from the peer reviewers to support that. So it's useful to have that to the fore of your mind, because sometimes the review process can be robust, but ultimately everybody wants to get to the best version of your book. We need 2 positive reports. That's essentially what we're looking for. So we tend to have to approach 4 or even 5 people at this stage to get 2 people who will commit to giving a peer review. They will be senior people in your field. We don't tend to direct our reviewers too much. And the reason being is if you only ask certain questions, you tend to get just answers to those questions back. And actually, the expertise of our reviewers mean that actually we want to get all their comments will be valuable. Sometimes there are very obvious questions that come to mind, and we may ask those questions. But by and large, we're asking them, is this original scholarship? Are you persuaded both by the research question and the approach taken to answer it? And back to my point at the start of my talk, is it adding something to debates in the field, and would you like to see this published? The process it's taking about 3 months. We had been able to suggest that we'd be able to get reports back within 2 months until quite recently, but there's so many demands on academics' time that we now have to recognize that to get the good reports back, it does take about 3 months. So again, when you're approaching publishers, reconcile yourself to the fact that it will be at least 3 months before you hear back. When the reports come back in, and as I say, we won't do anything until we have 2, because that gives us a fuller view of how your proposal has been received. We will usually have a conversation with you at that point. There is nearly always recommendations. It's extremely rare to get 2 reports that say, this is excellent, publish immediately. It's great when it happens, but again, just to manage expectations, that doesn't happen very often. The other thing that doesn't happen quite so often is 2 immediate declines. And one of the reasons that shouldn't happen very often is that actually as publishers, we should be doing that first filter. So, but it does happen on occasion, and it might be this is in an area that we're less familiar with. And for some reason, the sample chapter simply didn't support what we thought was an excellent proposal. What happens more often is it's either going to be it will be a supportive report. So we'll have 2 supportive reports, but that support is qualified. So the support will either be saying, yes, you should publish this, but I'm making recommendations. And it's the degree of those recommendations that are required. If they're relatively straightforward in that they're structural, they're saying, can you move this chapter to here? Can you elaborate on this particular discussion? Can you make sure you update the literature? A formal response is usually enough. If it's a little bit more fundamental, and by fundamental I mean there's concerns about the writing style, there's concerns that you haven't made your core argument as explicitly as you might do. And that's quite a common one, particularly with the first book, I have to say, that the readers go, I know what they're trying to do, but I have to work too hard to get to it. And I have to draw too many of the conclusions myself. If it's something like that, it will be a revise and resubmit. And that's when we will ask you to go away, really consider the 2 readers' reports, and revise your chapter, revise your proposal to reflect the recommendations of the readers. Revise and resubmit does go back out to the original readers. Tends to be a quicker review process at that point, just because the readers are familiar with the work and indeed they know what they're looking for. A formal response, if it's not too technical, we can usually manage that one in-house. Once we get either to the revise and resubmit or to the formal response, 2 positive reports, we can then take it to our in-house editorial meeting for contract offer. That, I think, looking at my time, I'm going to finish up in a minute, but just Emma asked me to talk about new editions. To pause very, very kind of briefly on new editions. Key to the new editions is actually the sales of the first book. That's always going to be your editor's starting point. So if it's a textbook, if it's a practitioner book, if it hasn't worked in the first edition, it's very unlikely we'll go to a new edition. So just bear that in mind. Certainly the commercials do come into play a lot more. New editions in monographs and academic works are a lot less common, just because in that sphere, research tends to evolve. So you don't really update, you tend to evolve your research. It tends to be much more for the textbook and practitioner book. And textbooks, An average new edition cycle, particularly for undergraduate, tends to be 2 to 3 years, postgraduate 3 to 4 years. Obviously, if a major piece of reform happens, you probably will get a publisher asking for, excuse me, my phone is ringing, so I'm just going to knock it off. I'm terribly sorry about that, but it was extremely distracting. My phone was ringing quite a lot in the background, so apologies that I had to leave. So about 2 or 3 years for a textbook if it's undergraduate, and 4 or 5 years for a practitioner book or a postgraduate book. The one thing I would say, if you are thinking of a new edition of an existing book, reach out to your publisher as early as possible, because what you don't want to do is put a lot of work into a new edition proposal and then present it to the publisher and they say, well, this is all very interesting, but actually from a purely commercial point of view, we wouldn't be interested. So I would certainly say have that conversation as early as possible. I'm going to stop speaking there because I've got 6 minutes left for questions. I do realize that was extremely general. You have my email address, or if you don't, Emma, I'm quite happy for that to be shared. So you can either follow up directly with me or indeed with any of my colleagues. But for now, I'll take any questions that people might have.
Great, thank you for that, Sinead. And I see Nicholas has his hand up. So Nicholas, I will allow you to go first, and then it's also a question in the chat.
Hello, good afternoon. I joined a bit late. Is it Miss Moloney?
Sinead, it's fine. Thanks, Nicholas.
All right, sure. Well, Sinead, I was wondering about the edited works. You mentioned that you could give a strong editorial guidance to make sure that they have a common theme and that you steer the ideas of the contributors. And I was just wondering how exactly you're supposed to maintain that quality control process for your edited works, even after you get approval.
It's difficult, I have to say. What I would say is what a lot of people do is they tend to have informal workshops where people come and they come with drafts, and that's very important. I think as much as you can see before you get delivery of final versions. Another thing that is extremely important is that the contributors know what the other contributors are writing on to avoid duplication. But also they can do those connections themselves. So if they understand that actually I know in part 4 one of my contributors is talking to this particular case, I can make links, I can reference, I can gesture to the fact that a more detailed conversation is happening in chapter 14, 12, whatever it might be. So I would say share as much of the information as possible with the other contributors, give as strong a steer as possible to the contributors. So, when the contract goes out, and you say, yes, we're good to go, and it all gets formalized, at that point, again, I would make sure that your editorial message on the purpose of the book is reiterated. Another practical point is keep people to length as much as you can as well. I do see, so sometimes some of my editors will CC me into correspondence that they're sending. And, you will see, quarterly, there'll be emails going around saying, we're having our first working drafts into us by this particular date. Then we all have time for comments. I'll need those back by a particular date. And it's keeping everybody on track. The most important thing, both in terms of quality and actually deliberately with edited collections, is you're only ever as strong as your weakest link. So keeping everybody kind of in the loop and communicated with is extremely important. You will, from a very practical stylistic point of view, you will get strong, very detailed style guidelines from us as publishing house, and that does help as well. We'll share them at the outset. So again, if you give that message, even from a stylistic point of view, that these are the conventions you want people to follow. Yeah, certainly, as I say, I've seen quarterly emails, I've seen informal workshops, and what is key is that contributors see other contributions as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sinead. And I see there's another question in the chat, and then I'm going to turn over to the Dean for his question. So Alexandra has asked, what are the most common mistakes you see in a book proposal that we should avoid?
The first one, I'll say very briefly, but it's a very obvious one, is people saying that their proposal is going out to lots of publishers. All academic publishers more or less ask for exclusive submission. Again, it's a very practical point, and people aren't always aware of that. The reason being, if we do decide we're going to send it out, we're asking a lot of our peer reviewers, and we essentially want to know that it's something that we have first refusal on. So if you put in, as people do sometimes, the publisher will come back and say, I see this is under consideration elsewhere. Once you give us exclusive submission, we'd be happy to go ahead with it. Basic things, I think the single most common thing, which I've said, and it bears repeating, is that when we can't get a handle on the book as quickly as possible within the body of the book proposal, and sometimes that's just people giving a very lead introduction into the subject. So you're talking an awful lot about what happened in your particular research area, and all the debates that are happening in the field. And really, it's only when you get into page 3 that you get to, this book answers this question. That should be first or second sentence, and short, pithy sentences as well. You will elaborate on all of that in the chapter. So the proposal really is to explain to me as a publisher and the peer reviewers precisely what the book is wanting to do in terms of, your academic ability and your analytical kind of strengths. They'll all be set out in the chapter. Small things like, it rarely happens, but typos, things like that, they just give a sense of either this is rushed or just the care that you'd like to see isn't taken. Sometimes, again, it doesn't happen very often, but just make sure that little things like that are caught. They're probably it, as I say, but certainly the point on exclusive submission is an important one. I think any publisher who would speak to you would probably point that out as well, and it does tend to happen, I have to say.
Okay, great. And I will hand it over to the Dean for the last question. So Dean, you can proceed, please.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And that's a great accent that you have.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise.
But I hear it's the most popular in the world these days. But I just had a question for more towards verification. So when one is doing a book or edited collection, is it possible to get a letter saying that this has been peer reviewed? And a second question, what type of statistics are you keeping that, let's say, an author can have access to? Will I get a yearly update on the quantity of sales in terms of hard copies, ebooks? Will I get, and at what point would the book sales carry forward where you might approach the person and say, we would like a second edition on this?
Sure. So in terms of the sales and the updates, really where you get that is in your royalty statement. So there will be, we pay royalties twice a year. It could vary from publisher to publisher, and that will have all that information. So you will literally get the breakdown of every sale, be it hard copy, be it digital, be it as part of our wider online library. So kind of the forensic detail you would get within that. But at any stage, if somebody wants to get a snapshot of how a book is selling, they would email their editor. So if someone had a book contracted with me, and this is not uncommon, I'll get an email going, just interested, how's it going? And I will send, usually it's just the top line figure. So the sales to date. Sometimes you can give a breakdown a bit more. It's selling here, it's selling there. If it's a textbook, we'll give a bit more information just because we'll have it. So we'll say, look, you've got the book on adoption here and the book on adoption here, because we monitor those quite clearly as well. In terms of the new edition, really, as I say, it will really depend on the type of the book. If it's a textbook, as I say, at the 2 or 3 year stage is when we tend to ask. the publisher, sometimes it's the market will nudge us actually, you know, we'll get teachers getting in touch going, is there a new edition of this book? Oh, that, you know, we've been using this book for a couple of years and it's getting a little bit out of date, but I'd like to stay committed to it. So can you let us know if you have a plan for a new edition? And that will put the thought in our heads that we need a new edition. The other thing really that will, if we think it's something that we want a new edition of, the other thing will be if there's major legislative change. So for example, you know, Brexit being an obvious one in the fields that I commission in, I immediately went, right, I need to look at all my textbooks, I need to look at all my practitioner books, and I need to work out, you know, which of these would benefit from a new edition. So there's a number of different ways. As I say, you know, a publisher will have, as to the timeframes I spoke to there, have this general idea of undergraduate textbook. You know, it's been 2 or 3 years since we published it. Let's take a look at that and see if we should have that conversation now. The market sometimes will actually ask for the new edition, that we will get an approach, or indeed something will happen from a legislative or substantive point of view that nudges us to say, actually, you know, it might be worth having a new edition here at this stage. And occasionally, sometimes those new edition conversations, if we don't think a new edition is viable, it might lead us to thinking that, okay, maybe not exactly the same book, but, you know, a follow-up book, or you know, looking at the particular point from a different perspective. So it might lead to another book, if not necessarily the new edition. So yeah, so in terms of your detailed breakdown, that will be in your royalty statement, but at any time you certainly can approach your editorial contact who can give you that information. And then the new editions, number of factors at play in terms of when we might reach out about it.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Sinead. I think this talk followed on really nicely from our last seminar where Roberta had talked about turning your PhD into a monograph and how it's different. So now we're basically on the next step where you've probably done your PhD in the monograph, but now you're thinking about more books, different types of books, including edited collections. I think this was very, very helpful. And thank you for your time today. We really appreciate Heart's presence and that you were able to step in so quickly. So now I'm going to hand over to our next speaker. So Jean-Pierre, if you can share your slides, please.
I can try. Here we go. Okay.
Great. So Jean-Pierre is here today from the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. And as you can see from his slides, he's going to be talking about doing applied legal research. So Jean-Pierre, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I'll start with introducing myself a little bit, and then I'll talk a little bit about BIICL, and then I will talk about applied research. Working off the past 7-8 years that I've been working at BIICL, doing applied research, but also my experience coming from a primarily academic background, but also working in the NGO sector, in the migration and human rights space. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Jean-Pierre. I'm the Arthur Watts Senior Research Fellow in Public International Law and Director of Teaching and Training at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. My main research areas, as I mentioned, are human rights and migration. I focus a lot on human trafficking, asylum, access to asylum, and those issues related to those topics. Besides that, I'm a visiting lecturer at the University of Malta, which is where I'm from originally. And I'm also the co-founder and co-director of an NGO based in Malta called the People for Change Foundation. And I mention these things not so much because of mentioning them so much as because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today reflects kind of that kind of multiple background that I come to research from. Let me just start with a bit of an overview about BIICL. So BIICL is the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. We're an institute that's been around for 64 years at this point. But even then, that was at the coming together of another 2 institutions at the time. So we are a pretty long-standing research institute. We're one of the top, we'd like to think, research institutes in the fields of international, comparative, and rule of law issues. We're organized around 3 centers. the Center for International Law, the Center for Comparative Law, and the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law. I will say, however, that most of our research will cut across all of these. So I, for example, sit within the Center for International Law, at least in my kind of research capacity at BIICL. But a lot of the work that I do has pretty significant rule of law angles, as well as comparative perspective. So for example, one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment has a comparative analysis of 14 countries as part of it, even though, yeah, it is within the Center for International Law. Besides the research centers, we also have a number of forums. The idea of the forums is that they bring together practitioners and academics. They're usually, well, not usually, they're member-based forums, which means that basically to participate in those discussions, you have to be a member of the forum, and that establishes kind of this possibility of engaging quite actively and quite directly, let's put it this way, with some of the key developments in the space. And we have 4 of those forums: product liability, competition, investment, business, and human rights. We publish the International and Comparative Law Quarterly. That's our journal. It is one of the top journals in international comparative and European law. It's, as you know, as you can imagine from the name, it's published 4 times a year by Cambridge University Press. We organize a lot of events. Our events tend to be somewhere in between academic and practice. A lot of our audience tends to be practitioner focused. Primarily, traditionally, it used to be obviously from the UK, because our events were in person. However, obviously, as of about 2 years ago, all of our events have gone online. And even though we're now moving back to starting to have face-to-face events, that is only going to be part of our event program, and most of our events will actually still happen remotely. We have a teaching and training program, so this is the second half of my job, and we run our own courses at BIICL. Again, some used to be face-to-face, but we've also been running our courses virtually. Last year, we ran 15 courses, training over 550 people. And our target audience is primarily people coming from governments in, across the globe, people working in industry, people working in legal practice, as well as some academics and students. And I mentioned some of this partly because a lot of the research that we do and that informs our events and our teaching and training is kind of informed by the fact that a lot of our audience is practitioner-based. A lot of the stakeholders within the Institute are not only coming from academia, they're also coming from legal practice. So we had kind of sit in the middle of those audiences and those conversations. And I think that's kind of what makes the role that BIICL plays quite interesting. And I think it gives us a little bit of a heads up or of a leg up, sorry, in terms of having an impact with the research that we're doing. So I'm going to be speaking a bit about applied research. And when I talk about applied research, I mean research that is directly related to what is going on, whether that's factual events, whether that's legal developments, whether that's litigation, whether that's the adoption of new legislation, whether that's informing future legislation, whether that's understanding how legal practice works, etc. So I kind of split the slide here in 2. So one is doing applied research, and the other is applying existing research or applying one's research. So just to start with the doing applied research part, I think there's the key point that I would like you to take away from this is that doing applied research isn't something that you do kind of at the end of the research when you try to apply it to something. Doing applied research requires you to think through from the very beginning, when you're designing the project, what is the research project going to do? What is the application of what it's trying to achieve? And I say this because very often when we have conversations in research projects that we're partners in or that I've been involved in different capacities under, for example, Horizon 2020, which is the EU kind of research funding stream, there tends to be kind of this idea of, oh, this is what the researchers want to do. And then we will get someone who will work on impact for the project. And, you know, eventually that impact person will hopefully manage to translate stuff into having an impact. And I think that only goes so far, right? You need to make sure that the project is designed with that impact in mind, with that design, with that content in mind. Basically, when you're thinking about a research project, if you want it to be applied research, you also need to be thinking about what particular angles or what particular aspects of this research topic are more likely to be relevant for application and practice, for example. The other question is timing. And a lot of research that we see tends to come up when there's an issue that has already come up or that's there right now. Was with applied research, timing is key, because if you want the research to actually be applied, to actually inform developments, to actually be considered when developments are being thought about, then you need to make sure that you need to beat the hype, right? You need to be thinking about topics for research that you think are going to come up in a few months' time, in a year's time, in a couple of years' time. Where is the trajectory of developments in this particular space going? And what topics do I think are going to be particularly interesting, particularly relevant, particularly important coming up? And I will say very often that's a guessing game. And in some cases, you will end up doing research on something that's very interesting, but eventually, you know, the conversation changes course completely. The other thing to keep in mind is the design and scope of the research, kind of making sure that, again, this impact is written into the entire design, including the methodology of the project. And the methodology of the project is an interesting one, because we find, or at least in my experience, that having consultations, having interviews, having engagement with stakeholders as part of the project is an important part of making sure that there is buy-in into the results, partly because people feel that their voice is actually represented, partly because you are then kind of making people aware that this research is happening. And then when you contact them to say, oh, this research has now been done, they're more likely to listen and to take you seriously. The other thing is the outputs of the research. Basically, we need to make sure that the outputs we're producing, and this is something that we always struggle with at BIICL, that the outputs we're producing are actually accessible. And accessible means a few different things. One is making sure that they're actually, you know, freely accessible on the website, etc. But the second is that they can actually be read and understood. And I think one of the things that we kind of, when we work with academic partners, when we work with practitioner partners, the conversations that we have with them about the styles of our outputs, the lengths of our outputs, etc., are something that's quite important. What we do very often is that we have kind of a whole series of outputs that are related to each other, but not entirely overlapping. So together with my colleague Rosanna, we're about to publish the outputs of a project that we just finished on the responsibilities of multinational corporations working in the tourism sector in Cuba, for example. And in that project, we have a whole series of outputs. So one is a long report with very in-depth legal analysis that will be published. But we also have a series of policy briefs targeted at different audiences, whether that's corporations, NGOs, or governments, because we know that basically no one is going to read 60 pages of legal analysis, but they might read, if we're lucky, the 2 or 3 page policy brief. We also tend to have executive summaries that are standalone, that you don't need to actually read the full report in order to make sense of them, but the executive summary stands on its own. And I think that's quite important. The other thing that's important is dissemination. And where do we disseminate the research? How do we disseminate the research? And there you have all sorts of different factors that come into play, things like the role of social media. For example, making sure that the message can be short enough or can be clear enough in the shortness of a social media post to attract interest in it from people who we assume are particularly busy and don't have time to read, again, 60 pages of report. The other thing is outreach, and I list this separately from dissemination, even though there's kind of a bit of overlap. But what I mean by outreach is looking at opportunities that come up to actually reach audiences that you don't usually reach, and to reach audiences with research that they might not think is particularly relevant to them. So this applies to things like members of parliament, for example, looking at all-party parliamentary groups in the UK context. So at BIICL, for example, we have the advantage that the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, which does a lot of our kind of more UK-focused work, it actually provides the secretarial services for the all-party parliamentary group on the rule of law. And that gives us a way in, both with the members of that group itself, but also with the members of that group as a way to reach other members of parliament that might not be in that group, but that might be interested in something specific. And the final thing is impact. And again, impact as something that you need to think about throughout the entire project and something that you need to monitor for. And I will say this, we do a bit of monitoring of impact. The problem with monitoring impact is that it is very difficult to monitor impact, and it is something that you need to monitor over a long period of time, very often after the end of the project, which also often means that it's after the end of the funding cycle for the project, which is not, and that sometimes makes it difficult to actually do that. And then the other part of the conversation for me in terms of applied research is applying existing research, right? And this is the need to kind of make sure that you're monitoring things like consultation processes. And different countries will do this differently, but kind of most governments or parliaments will have these consultation processes every now and again. Ongoing stakeholder engagement, making sure that especially if you're working in a particular area in a particular country, you do keep in touch with stakeholders, even when you don't have something specific to share with them, but making sure that they know that you're there and that you're doing research in this area. I find that to be quite useful in 2 ways. So one is actually for when you actually have something to share with them, to make sure that you can actually reach out to them. Essentially, it always helps if you're emailing someone specific on their own email address than if you're emailing someone on an info@ type email address. The other thing is there are some projects which are very impact focused. So we're just finishing a project funded by Horizon, for example, which produced, well, part of that project was producing these educational toolkits. And that is something that is directly impact focused. It's targeted specifically at something. We also work through help desks in some projects. So we are just starting a project looking at labor rights in Asia, focusing on informal workers in Asia. And the BIICL's role in the project, so we're working with 2 organizations, Solidar Swiss and Pragya, and they're both development actors, right? They're not academic institutions. They're Pragya does a bit of research, but most of their work is actually development work, working with workers and informal workers in particular. But they brought us in as a way to offer, so the project is creating these networks of informal workers and associations of informal workers as a way to overcome the lack of representation of informal workers in the labor rights space. And our role will be to actually give them analysis of international law, channels of international law standards that they can use to in their advocacy, basically. And that's an indirect way of having an impact. So our role will be to inform these organizations, and it is up to them to then use the information we're providing however they think works best. And in some cases, if you're really lucky, you get follow-on projects that focus on impact. So I mentioned the Cuba project. We had a conversation yesterday, coincidentally, with the funder of that project, where we were basically told, look, we have some additional funding. Would you like to work with us on the dissemination and impact side of your part of the project that we're doing? And we even have some funding to allow you to do that. Being a research institute that's independent, we don't have kind of student fees, etc., that make up, or grants from governments, etc., that make up our core funding. So we're always looking for project specific funding. So there's a few things to keep in mind with this sort of research, and I'll try to finish in a couple of minutes. So I've discussed the timing issue already quite a bit. The second thing is when you're working with stakeholders that are not researchers, or where research is not the priority, some of the data you will get will not always be research ready. And that can be really frustrating sometimes. Sometimes you have to go through, pages and pages and pages of data to make sure to kind of pull out the one thing that you think might be relevant for your research, but that's just part of the game. The ongoing engagement can sometimes be really frustrating because you might feel that you're having all of these conversations with these people, but nothing is actually coming of them. But it is part of the game in terms of having an impact and building those relationships. Impact as being core to the research rather than an afterthought, I think, is one of the probably the most important point that I would say. Questions of research integrity and research ethics come up quite a lot, especially when research is being funded, for example, by law firms, by people working in practice, by governments, etc. It is something that you need to constantly be on top of as you're working through the research, as you're developing the research project, as you're designing the project, etc. Research ethics very often, and I mentioned research ethics processes as one of the tools in this as well, are important. And I know that research ethics processes can be really frustrating sometimes because it always feels like you're spending a lot of time on these processes instead of the actual research. But I think they're really important in terms of helping you think through whether there are certain biases in your research, for example, that you need to be addressing. And in terms of research integrity, part of the issue is the sort of funding that you're applying for will often have a kind of direction that it's going in. And it's really important to make sure that the integrity of your research comes first before the research funding. And I know that's really difficult sometimes, especially when funding streams are not exactly flourishing. Let's put it that way. The other thing to keep in mind is the shelf life of research. One of the things that is particularly helpful is when you do a piece of research that eventually you can keep using repeatedly, and sometimes it comes back up. So, with the conflict in Ukraine, for example, and the issues around displacement from the crisis, something that we did back in 2016 when the Syria crisis was happening came back up. But it is something that you have to constantly think about. And, before republishing, retweeting, trying to reuse some of the past research, you have to really think of, has it expired, basically? Is this still good research today, given the new context? And related to that is sometimes you need to be careful about how you reuse certain research and what message you pass from that. One of the conversations I had with a colleague this week was we're putting together a list of past research that we've done that shows that is basically relevant to what's happening in Ukraine. And most of it is obviously research that we've done over the past kind of 5, 6, 10 years about different conflicts or about different contexts. And one of the questions that came up is a particular chapter that was written, which talks about disputed territories. And the question that we had to ask ourselves is, by posting this as something that's relevant, are we actually saying that Ukraine is actually a disputed territory, which is obviously a message that we do not want to give. So there's all these kind of little things that are worth thinking about as we go. Difficulties in measuring impact, I've mentioned already. Monitoring, evaluation, and learning, making sure that you're picking up lessons from the research as you go, but also from the impact and or lack of impact of particular projects to learn for future projects. A couple of tools that I've put on the right is the research ethics process is your friend. I can't believe I'm saying that. I remember doing my research ethics process when I was doing my PhD, for example, which was really frustrating process. It took forever, etc. But actually, it is a process that really helps you think through some of the issues, some of the repercussions of your research, both in terms of the design, but also in terms of who you're reaching, who you're not reaching, etc., etc. Couple of other things. One is working in a team. I find really helpful. Especially if you have a team that's kind of people that are willing and able to call you out on things. Basically, especially with things like making sure that the research has that target in mind, that impact potential in mind, but also issues around research integrity, what funding calls you apply for, etc. Having colleagues who are able to tell you, yes, actually, but what about this? That sort of things that are really, really important. And I must admit, I have colleagues at BIICL who are absolutely fantastic at this, and where kind of those conversations, which are very much ongoing, informal conversations, are really, really important. And the other kind of last piece of advice, I guess, or last tool, is looking beyond the usual funding suspects. By looking at funding opportunities in, for example, as I said, I work a lot in the migration and human rights space, looking at funding streams in the kind of development and humanitarian spaces very often help you think through projects that are much more kind of impact forward than if you're looking only at research councils, for example, as sources of funding. I will stop there. I think I went significantly over my time, so apologies for that. I do have my email address and other contact details on the last slide if anyone would like to get in touch. And I'm happy to, for my email address to be passed along.
That was really interesting, Jean-Pierre. I think you gave us an excellent overview of impact and the importance as well as difficulties. And I know Dean has to go to another meeting, so I'm going to let him ask his question first. As I see his hand is up.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. And it would have been great to have even more time to discuss it. But a very brief question in terms of impact. Do you think that impact factor journals and citations, and obviously high impact factor journals, do they demonstrate also evidence of research impact?
I think there's a correct answer and there's my honest answer. So I think the correct answer to that is yes. My honest answer is I think it depends a lot on the type of impact we're talking about. If you're considering impact as, being quoted 3 times by other academics, or 10 times or 20 times or 100 times, etc., then yes, I think being in a high impact journal does does make a difference. It makes a difference, I think, in a number of ways, one of which is it shows that academically, this article has gone through these processes, which means that it's likely to be kind of good research, etc. But it is also more likely to come up in searches, etc., if the journal has a certain reputation, etc. So in that sense, I think it's important. I will say this, I think the way journals are ranked and the way impact is measured in terms of deciding kind of what journal is high impact and isn't. And I will say this as coming from an organization that has a journal which is considered to be high impact. I think that process is often often flawed, especially kind of if you look at the specificity of certain areas, and that doesn't get reflected because obviously you don't have the breadth of organizations working on that. Most of the sort of impact that I tend to look at more is actual changes. And in that sense, I do find that high impact journals are not always necessarily reflective of that sort of day-to-day actual practice impact. One area where I think the two do come together is, I think if you're published in a high impact journal, you're more likely to be potentially taken seriously by judges, for example, in writing decisions. And in that sense, the two kind of levels of impact do come together quite a bit. But I don't think that should be the only criterion in which impact is measured by any measure. I think one way to measure impact, in my view, which is more effective, is by having conversations with organizations and stakeholders involved in your particular research field and seeing whether the kind of ideas and the analysis that you're developing is actually having that impact. The other key issue with high impact journals and practical impact is that very often high impact journals are behind a paywall. And whilst a lot of academics and academic institutions have access to them, in some cases, people working in practice, working in whether it's law firms, whether it's NGOs, whether it's grassroots organizations, do not have access to those articles. So sorry, I don't know whether that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it definitely touches on some of the issues, but not to put you on the spot, but let's say the high impact factor journal and citation scores will demonstrate that more researchers are engaged with your work. So therefore, let's say if I influence 100 researchers in terms of my work, those 100 researchers are going out meeting, volumes, maybe hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand worth of stakeholders in the area. And let's say it is a metric that has some value, whereas I have seen people talk about impact and they're discussing, even in some cases, they talk about impact in terms of the number of reads of their paper. And I mean, that can be distorted if I have 600 students who read my paper every year. That doesn't mean it's going to, it can be in a very low quality journal, book chapter, and they're talking about reads on, certain websites. Another thing is where people are recording impact. It seems to be a flavor of the month where they record impact because they get someone to write a letter and say, oh, I attended meeting X in Brussels or in, Westminster, and so is really influenced by my arguments, which emanated from my journal article. And I mean, that is arguably even someone's secretary who the person developed a good relationship with while they were at insert office name. And I mean, it just completely, to me, it doesn't register as impact at all. But they seem to be two common methods rising in law, because there seems to be, besides obviously your own organization, there seems to be a general it is changing, I believe, but let's say the view over the last 10, 15 years has been, we as lawyers, we don't believe in impact or impact factor journals. But as some of the law journals are rising in impact factor, there seems to be a bit of a change of heart. What is your brief view?
I completely agree with that. I was involved in a project, and it wasn't legal entirely. It was focused on radicalization. So it was working with academics across a range of disciplines. And the thing that I found myself saying over and over is impact dissemination is not impact, right? The fact that I wrote something or that people even read it does not mean it's had an impact. The only part I would disagree with slightly is the question of kind of someone's assistant who was influenced because of a connection that was made at an event. I completely agree that it's not exactly a good metric, but sometimes that is a way into having impact. If that person is now bringing up your research with the person that they're working with, or if the assistant is writing a lot of the output that the particular legislator, for example, is working with. But that would be the only bit that I would disagree with you on. I think I agree that there is a move towards journals again to some degree. I think part of the issue as well is how processes for recruitment of academics, but also promotions within academia, whether that's, in the UK, it's the ref cycle, etc. And I will say BIICL is outside of the ref cycle, so we're not refable as BIICL staff. But those processes do create kind of a focus on certain types of research and certain types of publications over and above others. The other thing I wanted to highlight, and I completely agree with you, that if you have an impact or an article in a high impact journal which is being read by others, and then that is influencing their teaching and their studies and their impact, that is definitely a way of reaching a much wider audience with one's research. And that is the sort of impact that is absolutely impossible to keep track of in some ways.
Thank you for that, Jean-Pierre. And I'm going to ask Nicholas to ask the final question. So Nicholas, you can take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Perot. So good afternoon, Jean-Pierre. I was just wondering whether you would have a significant Caribbean insight into the kind of research that your organization does, because I was just wondering, especially what you were saying about comparative law was very interesting to me, and it made me think in the context of the Court of Justice of the European Union administering the principles of the EEC treaty or whatever equivalent, as well as the Caribbean Court of Justice, which also administers principles relating to the interpretation of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas that established CARICOM and the CSME. And I was just wondering, because we see so often that they might transplant concepts from each other, the CCJ in its original jurisdiction, as well as the Court of Justice, I was wondering whether we could see like a lot of literature being created around the interaction then in those legal spheres.
Yes, and I think there's some of that interaction already. I don't know specifically about the Caribbean, I must admit, but for example, I know there's a lot of literature on the interaction between the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, for example. There's kind of some literature on that. It's definitely an area where we're seeing a lot more work on. One of my colleagues actually at BIICL focuses on climate change, and he just defended his PhD successfully last week, and the focus of that was specifically on circulation of legal models, which is exactly about this idea of kind of ideas from litigation in one country coming into litigation in other countries. And we see that also with decisions in the domestic courts, let alone at the regional and sub-regional courts as well. So we've definitely seen that in I believe in the Caribbean, but we've definitely seen that in the inter-American context and in the European context. And if you look at the decision that was published last year by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, for example, it took its kind of reasoning on jurisdiction, etc., directly from the work of the Inter-American Court. And I think that's one of those kind of interactions between different, obviously the committee is not a court, but it's still kind of that sort of decision-making process that is learning from one or the other. One thing that I would say is that very often when we do research that is comparative, we do try to cover different regions, and we have colleagues now, actually we're doing some work with CARICOM specifically that I must admit I'm not involved in, so I don't know all the details of. But for example, we have projects. One of my main projects at the moment is looking at determinants of anti-trafficking efforts, and we had countries in the Caribbean that were included in that as case studies because we wanted to capture that sort of part of the reality as well, and what is similar and what is different with other countries. We have the reports. We're in the comparative process at the moment, actually, of that particular project. Is that what you had in mind, Nicholas?
It's the sort of thing that I did have in mind, yes, and I was just wondering about the possibility then of exploring it as relating to the CCJ and the Court of Justice specifically. But I mean, you've already given me like a good foundation just for my own private reading to start from in terms of how the different legal systems might interact. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think one way I would go about doing this sort of research, and this partly goes back to when I was doing my PhD, I worked at the University of Greenwich in a business school, and I was teaching business law, but a lot of my colleagues did a lot of business network analysis. And something that I learned from them was actually mapping which judgments are being referred to in which other judgment and trying to see which ones are more influential than others. And if you look through the kind of judgments of a particular kind of court or tribunal and try to map what decisions it's referring to, that might be a good way of actually starting to literally map out that interaction between different courts. And I know we're out of time, but please do get in touch if you'd like to discuss kind of the design of a specific project. Something I'm quite keen on, so happy to discuss.
I think Nicholas is quite keen as well, Jean-Pierre, because I always tell him he should be pursuing a career in research. And I think he already has some ideas about what he wants to do. So Jean-Pierre, I must thank you. Your representation for BIICL was amazing. I think we all learned a lot. And Sinead, thank you as well. Again, we have had the pleasure of having really excellent speakers for the seminar series. And would not be possible without people agreeing to do this. So on behalf of the University of the West Indies Faculty of Law, we thank you both for being here today.
You're welcome.
And thank you all our participants, and remind everyone that the final seminar in the series will take place on Friday, April 1st. UE internal people, you will get the link via email, and for external candidates, the registration for that will open on Monday, and it's the same process as always where you get the Zoom link. So thank you very much, both of you, for today's session, and we hope we can invite you back again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend.